No, great. Thanks, Dan. Hi, everybody. I'm J.L. Bell. I'm a comics writer and reader, and welcome to our mainstream genres in indie comics panel. Storytelling genres are defined by different ways by literary critics. For the purposes of this panel, we're going to define them the way Barnes & Noble, that great literary critic, does, with groupings like science fiction and fantasy and western and romance. Some storytelling genres have always been a big part of American comics, like crime and detective stories. And of course, we know the comics basically invented this genre called the superhero story. There's also been a long tradition of science fiction and fantasy, and then there are genres like the westerns and romance and jungle adventures that no longer really dominate the comics. For a long time, literary critics dismissed genre fiction as less worthy of consideration than Yes.
I thought you were moving to the slide, sorry.
Thank you, Dan. For a long time, literary critics dismissed genre fiction as less worthy of consideration than literary fiction, and to extent art comics define themselves as opposed to, separate from genre. But those attitudes are changing, with more serious attention to how genres work and more literature acknowledging the power and the influence and the fun of genre conventions. In this discussion, we'll explore how mainstream genres have influenced four independent comics creators and how they have pushed back against the traditional conventions or strictures of those genres. I'm going to introduce them and mention a little bit about their work, and then I'll ask them to tell us more about their work and how they conceive of it. So starting closest to me, Blue Delliquanti is a comics creator from Minneapolis. Since 2012, Blue has drawn the Prism Award-winning web and print comic Oh Human Star. She also co-created the graphic novel Meal with Soleil Ho, I see that out in the audience, and The Stand with David Axe and Kevin Knoble. Oh Human Star its copy starts, Alistair Sterling was an inventor who sparked the robot revolution. And because of his sudden death, he didn't see any of it. That is, until he wakes up 16 years later in a robot body that matches his old one exactly. Next to Blue is Charles Forsman. Chuck is a three-time Ignatz Award winner, best known for the graphic novel The End of the Fucking World, which was adapted into its Netflix series. His comic books also include Revenger, celebrated summer slasher I Am Not Okay With This, and the new Automa. I hope I'm pronouncing that right. A graduate of the Center for Cartoon Studies in Vermont, he now lives in western Massachusetts. And here is the selling copy for Revenger. When all hope is lost, and those that meant the most to you have been ripped away, there is only one moment left, the moment of revenge. Out of the darkness stalks a blood-soaked nightmare, cloaked with the scars of her righteous mission. Again, you really get a sense of what this is all about from this. Andrew MacLean is another Massachusetts comic creator, this time from the North Shore. He writes and draws the series Headlopper, which has won a Diamond Gem Award, and he created Apocalyptic Girl, a sci-fi post-apocalyptic graphic novel. Headlopper, Volume 1 description from Image, the Headlopper, Nordrel, and the nagging severed head of Agatha Blue Witch arrive on the Isle of Bara to find it overrun with beasts, minions of the sorcerer of the Black Bog. And finally, at the far end of the table, Katie Skelly. She is a native of Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, where she started making comics in high school. She was an art history major at Syracuse University before going back to making art history of her own. She now lives in Brooklyn and is the creator of the graphic novels My Pretty Vampire and Operation Margarine, and the web and print comic Nurse Nurse. Nurse Nurse is about psychedelic nurses in space. The Comics Journal called it a Barbarella-esque, demurely sexy sci-fi spaceship romp. Now I'll ask each of you, starting with Blue, to introduce your comics work and how you see it relating to mainstream genres. Does it fit into a genre? Does it cross two genres? Was it inspired by certain genre work? Or are you consciously adding something new to the genre you've chosen?
All right, can you hear me okay, everybody?
Yeah.
All right, cool. My name is Blue Delliquanti. I am probably best known right now as the creator of Oh Human Star, which is, I call it a science fiction family drama. It is I'm trying to think of the best way to describe how I got into genre fiction, especially science fiction work. My work is probably across the board, like very queer. It talks a lot about LGBT themes especially. And that was something that I would see hinted upon in lots of mainstream genre work at the time. Like probably the most overtly I'd ever seen it was in Sandman, or at least that's what I grew up reading. In terms of other like American works that influenced it, the closest I can think of his style is maybe Concrete by Paul Chadwick. I don't know if there's any other fans of his work. It's so good, you guys. But it's also influenced a lot by manga, which kind of comes up in, you know, the time period that I grew up in and what was getting really big at the time. So there's a lot of mature kind of like, I think a lot about like very intimate character-driven drama and how it relates with extremely big like society impacting technological innovations. And that was something that I see a little bit of in mainstream American work and a lot more in other like comics cultures, although I think that's changing now. And that's something that really impacts my work, and that's what I like to add is, you know, very personal questions of identity and family and love and romance to comics about robots and artificial intelligence taking over the world. So, you know.
Thanks. And Charles?
Hey everybody, I apologize, I'm a little tired and also nervous, so there's that. So I guess I'm on this panel mainly for my books, Revenger and Revenger in the Fog, and those kind of came about, they were pretty stark left turn from my previous work, which was more inspired by early newspaper strips and teenage sort of dramas. But Revenger, it was sort of my reckoning with coming back to the movies and comics that I liked as a kid, and re-examining them and telling myself it's okay to like these and seeing new things in them. Because I think like most people, I rejected a lot of mainstream stuff starting in teenage years and started watching Tarkovsky movies and stuff. Which I still love, but I sort of came all the way back around and started to like Revenger's like highly influenced by this Sylvester Stallone movie Cobra, which is it's not well remembered, it's not very good, but I love it. It had such a great potential in it. Like there's so much about it that I love that I kind of felt like. I could take some of those elements and from that and put it onto my own thing. But yeah, it's sort of it was like just an expression of I like this stuff, and I wanted to play with it because I was kind of terrified to do that. So it was just sort of a push. I get bored easily, so I liked the sort of drawing in a totally different style and doing something I was super uncomfortable with. And that's sort of what pushed me into doing a genre type comic.
Great. Andrew?
Yeah, my name is Andrew MacLean. I'm probably best known for my fantasy comic Headlopper. I mean, I've loved mainstream comics and indie comics both, at least in certain periods of my life. So I had been drawing for a few other artists for a little while on things I wasn't really excited about working on. So I just wanted to make something I was just fun. And I was still pretty comfortable with, just jumping into kind of mainstreamy genre. I didn't put much thought into, I don't know, what is mainstream, what isn't, or what is like, your identity. I just wanted to make something fun that I just thought I would want to read. I wanted it to look the way I would want to look at something and have characters that I would enjoy. So I just pretended I was the audience, and I really like indie art, and I really loved watching Arnold Schwarzenegger as Conan as a kid, and I love Ray Harryhausen movies, and I love heavy metal music, so I wanted to make a fantasy with even some of its archetypes, hopefully with some of its warts shaved off, and I wanted to make a book that was that firmly landed in the fantasy genre, felt familiar. I wasn't really trying to, necessarily discover something new other than maybe, stick in some dark humor, which I thought would be. I actually stuck in jokes for myself, thinking no one else would have the same deranged sense of humor, but somehow people caught on. And I just went 2 feet in. I was like, oh my god, genre thing, and whatever it is whatever it is. And that one's held on.
All right. And Katie.
Hey, I'm Katie Skelly. I would say my sort of like intro to genre in comics is like forgotten, perhaps like best forgotten genres that came out of Europe in the 60s and 70s. So like erotic science fiction, erotic vampires, erotic like going outside, like anything that was just like really, really horny, but also really beautiful, but like almost banal in like its subject matter. So I really, I loved Barbarella, the original Jean-Claude Forest Barbarella comics, the original translations. And that was kind of my like into sci-fi, because it wasn't hard science fiction. It was just like beautiful, women running around the galaxy and getting attacked by like roosters and chickens that were gigantic, or parakeets, or at one point they get bitten by like Victorian dolls that are evil. Like just really like, oh, okay, I don't need to be able to be like Moebius. I don't have to draw like that. I can just throw a bunch of really crazy ideas out and say that it's outer space. And like that was kind of my in. So that ended up being pretty great. And then as time went on, it's like kind of moved away from that and moved more into horror, and then just like straight, eroticism, and, looking at stuff like Guido Crepax and Manara, just like that type of genre that's very broad, but also very specific in its sort of execution. So yeah, I would say that was my main sort of in.
All right. Now, mainstream American comics not only clump around certain genres, but they also have clumped around certain art styles. And Katie, you were just talking about how your art style is your own, and you were able to apply it to this story. So, starting on your end, why don't we talk about the choice of artistic styles and how they talk about are in dialogue with mainstream American comic style?
Yeah, well, I think when I got started doing Nurse, which feels like a million years ago now, it was really just kind of taking a lot of cues from manga and from black and white American indie comics, almost from like the 80s and 90s, because I was working in black and white because I was cheap and I was just getting started, and I was going to Kinko's back when I was still around. And so much that they thought I worked there. That was like my whole life, was just being in Kinko's, photocopying this. But it was really just about keeping it sort of cheap and keeping it easy to produce, which was also kind of the ethos of those comics of the 80s and 90s. So it was a style that I think people related to if they were manga readers, because there are a lot of like tropes that are very similar, like the pacing is similar, some of the dialogue to like science fiction manga comics. So yeah, I think it was something that stood out just enough, but there was also enough of a familiarity with it that people were interested in it and picked it up. Yeah.
And Andrew, you're not drawing like John Buscema, but you're drawing this sword and sorcery landscape in your own way.
Yeah, I mean, I guess when you think of, say, fantasy or sci-fi, certain kind of art styles come to mind. But I guess I just have always had kind of my story ideas develop kind of independent of my art tastes and interests. So it's like there's a lot of books that I may not even be interested in so much in the story, but I love the art and vice versa. So I guess in my mind I've just tried to work on a way that I like to draw things, and then there's a handful of stories that I like to tell, and whatever that story is, I don't think too much about, well, how do I want this one to look, because I just draw in whatever my current style is, and it's usually, I don't know, cartoony or lumpy or like, I don't know, it's always shifting, but yeah, it's not like a conscious effort, but I do personally enjoy the kind of like paradox in like having a style not exactly be what you would expect, of a genre.
Mm-hmm. And Charles, you've taken a different approach.
Yeah, I always I always say that I'm a stylist cartoonist in lacking style. And it used to really bum me out. Like I admired Andrew, like because he has such a distinct look. Like you look at his drawings, you know it's him. And that used to really bug me when I was younger. But I sort of, instead of bashing my head against the wall, I sort of took it on as the way I work. So with every new project, I kind of will try on a new artistic costume in a way. So like with Revenger, I was looking at a lot of Frank Miller, Klaus Janson, Jorge Safino, and the colors especially. Klaus Janson, he's known for inking over Frank Miller, but he colored a lot of comics in the late 80s. My favorite thing he did was this epic comic called St. George that he penciled and inked and did all the colors. And the colors in that are just one of my favorite things in the world. It was still using the old process just before computers came in. So I tried to sort of mimic that. But yeah, that's kind of where I'm always kind of shifting the way I draw.
The 2 pages up here are from End of the Fucking World and Revenger, and you can see how different they are. And Charles has another book, I'm Not Okay With This, with yet a different style, which is quite an interesting approach. And Blue, how about your style? You talked about manga influence or something?
Yeah, there's some manga influence. I mean, my entryway into comics was probably Western comics. I kind of came in at the right time with like lots of superhero, media and, not just movies, but like lots of the cartoons directed by Bruce Timm. I think I was probably pretty strongly influenced by Bruce Timm at the beginning. I noticed I absorbed a lot of Western comics at a time where they were not particularly great, and the kinds of art that stood out to me were very distinct art styles, like Stuart Eminem is an example, David Mazzucchelli. A little later on, I got really, really into Mike Mignola. Like, he was a really big influence too. And I think later when I went into manga and absorbed a lot of influence from there, like kind of similar style, like Hiromu Arakawa, who did Full Metal Alchemist. Oh my God, Naoki Urasawa, his book work Pluto really influenced me too. Like, I think I absorbed a lot of like simple, clean, like geometric kind of like, well rendered like forms, but done in a very simple, clean art style, but influenced by a lot of lighting and pacing, stylistic components of manga, especially from like the shonen and seinen genres like this. Although with Meal, I ended up looking at a lot of shoujo, like comics for girls and women, and a lot of stuff from the 70s that's like extremely over-rendered and groovy and lots of really good textures, like Moto Hagio is an example. So I don't know, I've been trying to branch out more and learning to really love screen tones and textures, so that helps. But for O Human Star, lots of very crisp, clean line work by like Alex Toth as well, so that was a big influence early on, was kind of my pole star.
And introduce us to how you're using color in O Human Star.
Oh yeah, with O Human Star, I have a limited color palette. There's essentially 2 parallel storylines. The primary storyline, in which this inventor wakes up in a robot body and has to get his life back together, is all this crisp, cold blue. And then every time there's a flashback to give us more context as to how these characters met, how they came together, it's in this like warm kind of salmony orange pink. And all of it's unified by this brown line work that I like because it's just a little warmer. It warms up the blues and it tempers and grounds the oranges in a way that
Okay. Are there, you talked earlier about some of the early influences about the genre fiction that you read as a child or children, and then were there times where you got away from that because it was like too immature and then you came back? How does that, how do you remember your early genre storytelling experiences, and how have your ideas changed? When did you realize, for instance, you were reading a genre that goes over some of the same tropes?
That's a good question. I mean, I love science fiction. I feel like there was a lot of really good science fiction, fantasy, prose work for kids. I think that in Western comics, like in the late 90s, early 2000s, there could have been a great influx of work that was friendly for kids. And the big two publishers just did not know how to do it. Like, there were all of these amazing cartoons, like the Batman animated series, Teen Titans, Static Shock, just to name a few. And the comic book publishers could not figure out how to take these extremely big franchises and make them child-friendly. Like, there were like these pretty great X-Men movies, and the X-Men comics coming out were like considered the worst runs of all time. Like that uncanny X-Men section where like Kurt, Nightcrawler finds out that his dad is actual Satan. It's awful. And like, I think a really good example was I had all of these weird one-off like things of like Daredevil. Like they're just really weird. It's like Daredevil like trying to like stop cocaine smugglers, and I'm 10. I'm like, what's coke? I don't know. And like in the middle was this ad for this like weird new series getting translated called Neon Genesis Evangelion, and I was like, I don't know who this girl is in her red outfit or this big robot, but I want to read that. That looks cool. That looks like that's about children. It is. There's some caveats to it, but like I feel like that is a great like microcosm of exactly what was happening in America in the 90s and kind of what led to a lot of people my age picking the way they picked. So, you know, I think there's a lot of missed opportunities, but there were some also cool results of that too that we're starting to see in people working now. So.
And Charles, you talked about deliberately trying to figure out, do you want to work in genre?
Yeah, I mean, I think when my older brother got me into comics originally when I was around 10, and that was 1990, around when Jim Lee took over X-Men, and like that big 90s boom happened, and I whole hog into Image Comics and loved that stuff. Brad Liefeld and Spawn and all that. And yeah, like I rejected all that stuff when I discovered like alternative comics, I guess. My friend probably gave me a bunch of 8-balls, I think, when I worked at the movie theater, and that sort of changed my idea of what comics were and where they could be. And I just fell in love with this other way that comics could exist. So it kind of just like took me off all the genre stuff for a while. And I stopped reading comics for a long time. I just listened to music and watch movies and stuff. But when I got back into it was still in like the serious graphic novel stuff. The big boom was happening, and I ended up going to school. And I was still like rejecting all that superhero stuff, and it was more of a recent thing where I tend to get obsessive and I'd start collecting things. So I started bin diving and kind of rebuying all the comics I had as a kid, and then discovering new stuff, like weird 80s black and white boom stuff that maybe some kid worked, you know, he's probably 16 and she had worked like a whole year on one issue and only put one out. And I really fell in love with that stuff. I saw this like really cool passion in there. Ben Maher calls it the passion. I'm ripping off his phrase for it because he's really influenced by that stuff. And yeah, I just started to be able to look at almost anything and find something that was interesting to me, even though necessary, you know, like most people look at it just like not, you know, to scoff at it or whatever. It looks amateurish or whatever. But I saw a real power in there, and like just urge to create that really kind of fueled me. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
If that makes sense.
Andrew, any thoughts on that? Or you seem you might be the most comfortable with just doing.
Yeah, I'm pretty comfortable.
genre.
Well, it's my kind of comics path was in reading and stuff was not, I don't know, was maybe not unique, but probably not, you know, all that common either. It was like when I was a kid, I lived in a really rural area. We didn't have a comic shop. I think that I had a very small selection of comics. and they're all superhero, and to me, comics meant superhero. And so for me, my love of genre came, I don't know, probably from like just started with a love of just monsters, you know. And fantasy and sci-fi has a lot of that stuff. So I fell in love with fantasy and sci-fi mostly from, you know, movies, I guess. And I read comics as much as I could, and which wasn't often. And then in high school, I was starting to get a few more. I worked at this grocery store, but they didn't order much, so just a handful of superhero comics. But I just obsessed over the artwork mostly. And it wasn't until I think college that I moved to Boston and actually like got to spend some time in some real comic shops where I found like Hellboy. And reading Hellboy, I was like, all right, there's a lot of different stuff going on in Hellboy. It's clearly an art style that's really unique. You know, the stories are pulpy and weird and sometimes funny and like kind of classical kind of horror stuff. And like that stuff was all fun and interesting, but it also just said to me like, oh, comics aren't superheroes. Comics are just a medium. That was like, it kind of seemed silly to be like 25 and first figuring out that comics can be anything. But it blew my mind, and then I just like couldn't help but be like, all right, if Hellboy exists, there's got to be all kinds of different comics, and I just went and just tried to find things from, you know, varied, you know, art styles and everything. So I feel like majority of my comic reading, or like even the quality reading, is much, much later in life. So like my not having any kind of beef or discomfort with, say, you know, what mainstream might be and indie might be, is probably just because I never had this kind of like this period where I left mainstream comics to go check out indie comics. It was just always, as a kid, it was like, get your hands on any comics you can, which wasn't much. And then by the time I was an adult, I was just an adult, so I was just, I didn't have, at the time, I wasn't planning on making comics for a living. I had like maybe one other friend who even read comics, so it was just a very, like, it was just me. I didn't have anyone to like answer to or prove to, so I was just kind of comfortable with whatever it was. So by the time I was like, oh geez, I think I want to make comics, I was already like, hey, comics can be anything, there's really no rules. So I just started making them, and I didn't really ask myself those kind of questions of like, what are my expectations? I kind of like felt like just in wanting to make comics again, I was a part of the process of just not having to answer those questions for myself anymore.
Okay.
What was the original question again?
Well, the original question was about your early experiences with genre storytelling, and also when you realized that they were genres, and was there any moment at which you thought, well, I'm 18 now, I'm doing only mature literary fiction, or did it not work that way for you?
I don't know. It's hard because I never really quite know what all the like rules of any genre that I get into are. Like I know some of the tropes, but then, you know, I never really set out to like fulfill expectations of like, okay, if you're a pure genre reader, like this is what you're going to want to read, and like check mark. You know, it's more kind of like, I know this is the general like structure of how this genre works, and so I'm gonna like bring my own experiences into that and just try to fill it out the way that I understand it to work. So like it's all just basically hypothetical and like imaginary all the time. So in that regard, I've never failed.
And you talked about tropes of the field. Sometimes if just too many people out there are using tropes through no fault of your own, they become cliche. Are there certain things in the genres you work at that you decide, I want to avoid this, and there are certain things that you say, actually, I want to lean into this, and I want that moment in my story?
Well, there are some things, because I tend to work in more like exploitation type genres. There are a lot of things in exploitation that are gnarly. It's called exploitation. Like, so, you know, as someone who is like a, you know, relatively cognizant person living in, you know, the 21st century, I try to avoid the stuff that eventually, like, at first repulsed me from that genre. Not so much to correct it, but again, to bring my own sort of experience to it. So when I, would go to make my Barbarella type comic, I would not, consciously put in sort of, like the more sexploitation stuff that involved lack of consent or involved, anything that was just sort of like, that made me feel like, ugh, I just kind of, it's not that I wanted to take like any sort of ick factor out, because I put that back in, but I did it my own way, so I was like, if I'm going to repulse you, like it's going to be on my sort of terms.
And any other responses to that question?
I'll take it. I have a similar approach to Headlopper. Is like a lot of genre stuff. It hasn't aged all that well. I remember the last time I watched Cobra, the opening scene. I was like, oh man, 2017 or whenever it was. I was like, man, that doesn't feel as good as it used to. But yeah. So I mean, I don't want to. It's supposed to be for fun, so I don't want anybody to feel left out or hurt anyone's feelings or whatever. So I'm doing my best to dance around those things. Otherwise, I like to kind of I like to kind of create, the archetypes that we expect. I mean, the main character in Headlopper is a big swordsman who's stoic and like not good with words or emotions or whatever. That's like exactly what we expect. But where I try to kind of, take that very,
that kind of archetype of a character and take it in what might be a new direction is just, I treat him like a regular human being. Like, I'm putting them through these, extreme situations where they make friends and they lose friends and all these things. And so I just make sure that the stuff I put these characters through pays a toll, like they're a real human being, And I think that wasn't like a conscious decision, like, oh, I want to change the genre or whatever, but it was more just the result of, I think it first clicked to me was just watching, honestly, The Sopranos, just like seeing the three sides of Tony Soprano. It feels like that's a writing class, that show. It's like you have Tony the mob boss, and you have Tony the family man, and you have Tony, really pretty vulnerable in his therapy sessions, and you can just watch that show and it's spelled out for you. Tony's in therapy sessions, so he's like, oh, I feel this, if he's not being grumpy or whatever. And like, so you can see Tony feels this way because of this, and you see how he feels about, say a family issue, how that affects him, in his professional life or his mob life or whatever. So I that really got my head turning about like, all right, well, when I put my characters through things, those things are going to affect all aspects of their life going forward. And like reading the old like pulpy Conan things and whatnot, or like Fafhrd the Grey Hauser. It's every time you open a new old fantasy story, your characters are kind of starting from zero usually. They don't usually carry too much burden with them into the next adventure. So I just do my best to, even if it wasn't the plan, and just be like, oh man, all right, that was a big adventure for Headlopper and Agatha. Like, what's next? I'm like, well, we're kind of gonna have some baggage from the last time. So I try to do my best, just make sure that that stuff, has a toll on these characters.
Mm-hmm.
I've got an answer, but before I answer, can I ask, so Cobra, that's the movie where Stallone, he's like a cop, right?
Oh, yeah.
That's like, his name is like Cobretti?
Marianne Cobretti.
Great. Such a great like 80s face.
It was, okay, can I?
Yeah, go for it.
It was, they originally asked Stallone to be in Beverly Hills Cop, and he took the script and basically turned it into Cobra. He's like, hey, why don't we change the guy's name to Cobra, and I'll do all this stuff, and they were just like, no, and they went with Eddie Murphy. But he went on to make the movie he wanted to make, so that's how we got Cobra.
That's great.
Yeah.
What an inspiring story. When I was thinking about it, there's two kind of like big science fiction tropes that I feel like I think of consciously. And if any of you watched a Star Trek like anything, you kind of know about the trope of like going to the planet where these people are going through this thing and they're the stand-in for insert marginalized group here. Like, you know, they have some kind of struggle or thing that is like supposed to be an allegory for real life, like group undergoing marginalization. And something that I wanted to tackle in No Human Stars specifically is that, you know, there are lots of allegories in the, you know, way that I depict, like being an artificial intelligence and like having your, you know, identity being compounded by your past life as a real person and your existence as a robot now, and having that be an allegory for trans identity. But also, along with like all of the things that go with being like a robot and like, you know, being like passing as a human being, they're also transgender. Like there's a character who is like a robot, the most like advanced robot in the world, and she, you know, wants to pass as human and like not be read as any other way by her human friends. But she also went from like being like read as like a boy to being read as a girl. So like I get talked about, like people to bring that up to me a lot. Like I appreciate that she has this allegorical thing, but she is also the thing. Like, so I think about that a lot. Also, like just as like a storyteller, something I think about a lot is what my friend, I think it's Melanie Gilman, calls like the largest men's bathroom in the world, which is just the idea of if you read like a hard sci-fi story and then you just don't encounter any women, it's so much more fun to imagine the entire place taking place in a large men's bathroom. Have you reread like Foundation by Isaac Asimov lately? That is the biggest men's public restroom I've ever read. Like, it's fascinating. So like, I don't know, just like, especially in a visual genre like comics where you're populating like a city or like a fake planet or whatever, and just having, you know, like enough women in your crowd scenes, or like people who are like have a physical like disability, or, you know, they, you know, like have like a different sexual identity, like that is something that, you know, people might make a stink about it and they'll think that there's way too many gay people in this scene or whatever, but also, you know, it reflects life in a way that the right people notice. So I think in some hard sci-fi, like pulpy stuff especially, I think that's cool to do.
Do you think that the comics medium lends itself particularly well to fantasy, science fiction, bloody violence, other big visual things, or have American mainstream comics conditioned us readers to look for those things and conditioned us that we happen sci-fi or fantasy or crime readers are attracted to comics because we've come across that? This may not be an answerable question, but do you find particular types of stories working better in the comics medium?
I was just thinking about this earlier. I do depict a lot of violence in my books, and someone came up to the table and was talking about the end of the fucking world, and he said he watched the first episode of the TV series of it. And he couldn't watch anymore because he said it was too much, like he couldn't handle it. But he loves the book. And that made me think, in relation to this panel, I was like, oh, well, you know, I think that is something that maybe comics is good at, in presenting ugly things like violence, where it's not so photographic, that it can be depicted in a more cartoonish way, that it's easier to take in and you're in control of the pace and how you turn the pages. And yeah, I mean, and also you can draw whatever the hell you want in comics. You know, there's no budget or anything, so it's really good at that, at fantasy. And you know, I'm sure like everything you depicted in that book, you know, it's like you can draw whatever you want.
Yeah, exactly.
So it's kind of endless in that way. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's cool too, you know, and what you're saying is also with comics, there's less cooks in the kitchen. When you make a movie, there's a bunch of artists. There's a lot of like testing, like, oh, people prefer monsters with tentacles, you know, and you have a singular, or you can have a singular vision in comics. And so if I read, you know, The Inkle, even though it's, you know, loaded with, you know, Jodorowskyisms, I at least know I get to look at all of his designs, you know, and you can just marvel at the beauty of like one hand, one kind of design aesthetic or whatever, like in repetition in all the little details and stuff. And I don't know if that necessarily makes, you know, comics a better medium for genre stuff, but if you're a fan of, you know, just visual art, you know, a flat image, it's the best place to find that for sure.
This is probably a really dorky answer, but I really like the logistics of like what makes comics, like what you can do in comics that you can't do in prose, just because of the nature of the medium. Like, I really like how you can screw around with time or depicting time passing in comics in a way that doesn't really work with prose. I also really like, I mean, and this is for, you know, me in particular doing a comic where you talk about a lot of gender stuff. Like, in comics, you can basically tell a story without having a pronoun in it. And like, I find that like, I'm really influenced by the book The Left Hand of Darkness by Ursula Le Guin, which screws around with pronoun use a lot because it's being told, like, if you haven't read it, it's like takes up place on a planet where nobody has a fixed gender, but it's told from the perspective of an Earth man who did not grow up in that. So he basically genders everyone a he until he realizes that he can't. And like, even though that's part of the story, it still kind of colors the way you as the reader perceive these people. And with comics, like, you can play around with that, and like, I don't know, I feel like you perceive the characters differently, or maybe more as they are, if you take away this mechanic that is essential in lots of English prose, but is completely unnecessary in English language comics. I don't know, I think that's super cool, and it's a really wonky thing to think about, but I like thinking about it.
All right. There was a mention earlier of reader expectations, and to some literary theorists, that's a very big part of what defines genre fiction, that the readers are coming in with the knowledge of their last 50 science fiction or last 50 romance novels that they've read and are comparing it. How do you think about reader expectations, and especially since we have two webcomics creators and two mostly print magazine and graphic novel creators, you must have different levels of feedback, different rhythms that happen. So how do reader expectations affect what you do, or do they? And, Katie, you can start, but also I want to make sure, I know, Charles, you had something to say about this in an interview, as I recall.
I mean, I don't think about the reader when I'm making anything, because if you create and analyze at the same time, it just falls apart, so I try not to do that. But to me, I'm always kind of like, I feel like I'm working in a genre that I'm inventing like as I create it. Mm-hmm. So it's sort of like setting up a blueprint for something that's new. So yeah, I mean, I think, you know, if you are the type of reader that approaches something and you want like XYZ thing to happen in it, then I just wonder why you're reading anything new at all, because it seems like you found that already. So why would you know, go out seeking something and continually be disappointed? Like, that's, you need to go to a doctor. Like, that's crazy. So I think, you know, it just like it shows a certain lack of imagination to follow those steps and not really take any divergences from them. So yeah, but I don't really. At this point, I don't really know that there are any readers like that exist anymore, or creators like that exist anymore. I think, you know, we have the type of sort of market in this world of comics that people are looking for new stories, new experiences, new voices, and people are, you know, we have tons of new creators that are able to give that to them. So I think we're actually in a really great place in comics right now.
I expect readers to understand the kind of basics of fantasy when they come into Headlopper. I'm not a huge fan of starting, you know, sci-fi or fantasy and getting like a laundry list of new definitions, like all the different political factions and what we call magic this time and how magic manifests itself in a universe. I don't care about all that stuff. I don't want to have to like memorize things. I just want to kind of go for a journey. So in Headlopper, I'm like, hey, you know magic is a thing, and you'll know it when you see it. I don't like say this is how magic works in Headlopper or any of that stuff. I just kind of just jump in 2 feet, and you'll pick it up as you go. And I also try to keep it pretty simple so that you don't need like definitions or anything. So I guess in that I have this expectation that like, hey, there's a talking witch head, that's probably magic.
It follows porno rules. Yeah. You know when you see it.
I'm trying to remember what we were talking about.
Reader expectations.
Yeah. I'm pretty similar to Katie in that I don't think about it at all if I can help it, because it would paralyze me. I would never draw anything because I'm definitely, that's when I get writer's block, is when I'm worrying about what a reader or an editor or someone is going to think of it. So I've learned to trick myself into never ever ever thinking about that.
Sorry to bring it up.
No, this is good. This is like therapy because I reading it like a mantra. And also and this kind of ties in with, I guess I didn't really say much about tropes and stuff, but like any genre tropes or cliche, that's the fun part, right? Is like the reader's expecting something out of the certain type of story that you're presenting, and you get to subvert that or turn it on its head. I think that's what and all these lines are blurred. I feel like the reason this panel exists is because people, I don't know everyone's age, but our generation is a lot more open to every kind of genre or serious work or whatever. There used to be a much more defined line, especially in comics, between alternative comics and mainstream, where you couldn't cross sides without getting yelled at or something. But everyone likes everything now. It's not uncool to like X-Men or whatever. It's there's a great big orgy happening, and it's really nice.
Yeah, there are definitely pros and cons to both serializing a webcomic and publishing a graphic novel traditionally, now that I've done both. There is kind of the vague tyranny of commenters on webcomic pages, and this is something that obviously is optional. I didn't have to sign myself up for this. I did. Because there are benefits to commenters will always be the first to point out when you've spelled something wrong. Because you've stared at the same page for 46 hours and you've stopped recognizing words as words, and they'll be like, oh, you used the wrong there and there. And I'm like, okay, thank you. That was helpful, actually. I don't mind that. But, then you also have to, at least in my case, because I have a long-form comic that has been expanded on for 6 years, people will forget that things happened, that if you were reading it all in a paperback book, it was like, oh yeah, that happened at the beginning of the book, 2 chapters ago. But if you were a regular webcomic reader, that may have happened, 5 years ago in update time. And so they're like, wait, am I supposed to know who that is? And it's like, that's the crush of the main character. She's been pining over them for years. And then but it's not really anyone's fault. It's just sort of, that's how that person came into that comic, and there's not much you can do about it. So it's mostly just keeping it in perspective. You don't have to sign yourself up for that. There are benefits, but it will also make you grind your teeth. And there's nice things about not having to deal with that in graphic novels, but also you can't catch mistakes until you see them in print, and you realize you forgot to repeat a pattern on someone's shirt, and that's just they're staring at you forever. You could have caught that a year ago before it went to print, but you didn't.
Okay, I'd like to open up the floor to questions from the audience, if anybody has things for all the panelists or particular ones. Yes, sir.
I had a specific question about Headlopper, where you mentioned I don't need to tell the reader what magic is, they know it, but and how a lot of people get too specific, do you have those like specifics, I know what magic does in this world, or is more magic does what I want with this story because that's how magic works?
Yeah, I've been thinking a little bit about it. I don't want, magic isn't gonna, I don't want it to be something to like fix my problems. And I do want it to be, I want to draw a lot of sword fights too. Like, so I never want magic to become this like really important thing. I feel like it has kind of become more and more, important as we kind of like learn more about why Agatha can talk. And, but yeah, I mean, I think Vignola, he calls it folklore logic or something. Like you have like, it's almost like you know what you want the tone of your book to be, so you know where you don't want magic to do. But that's it. I even though this isn't like our Earth, it's not our universe, I do think of them as being scientifically limited. So I don't want the characters to know like the origin of magic or why it works, but it does,
And for Blue and Katie, as you've been writing these long stories, have you been finding out more about the science, how science works in your universes? Has it changed? Have you been tempted to, or did you start out with a very clear definition at the beginning?
I tend to like soft science fiction as a rule, where there's like a established logic. Like there are things that are not possible and are possible, but for A Human Star, at least I kept it intentionally vague, but informed by, I'm more interested in like how technology informs what society does than what that technology, like how precisely it works. I have a lot of very nice readers who are programmers who very obviously know more about programming computers than me, and they ask me all these nice questions. I'm like, I don't know. I have a liberal arts degree and a wired subscription. That's all I know. Like, I'm way more interested in like, what cell phones have done to human communication than how cell phones work. I don't know. There's some interesting stories about like Hedy Lamarr and how she's responsible for, how cell phones work, but otherwise that's not that interesting to me, I guess.
Yeah, I threw everything at the wall when I first started doing Nurse Nurse, and then as time went on, I was like, oh, I have to remember all that. So I stopped doing that after everything was basically established. I was like, just leave that alone. But now I work in horror, and that's a whole other sort of game where like if you have anything sort of supernatural going on, you have to track that. And I did a vampire comic called My Pretty Vampire, and I'm like, okay, these things from this mythology I'm keeping and these I'm inventing, and like I should probably address these things that everyone expects to be part of vampiric lore, like what happens when they are out in daylight, and I liked drawing them bursting into flames, so I was like, I'll keep that. So and then cats hate them, and all that kind of stuff. So yeah, basically just kind of holding on to the things that are like, it's gonna be easy for me to remember this, like let's be honest, and also I'm going to want to draw this because it's not just like the conception and making sure everything is consistent. It's also like I'm committing to draw this for about 2 years. So from tip to tail of a project, it's like you have to enjoy drawing it, enjoy talking about it when you take it out on tour for a couple of years. You have to like everything for so long. So why hold on to the stuff that you're not interested in?
And that's, of course, one of the great appeals of mainstream dramas. They can be fun. They can be a lot of fun. Yeah. Are there any other questions? Yes, in the back.
My question is for Blue. Regarding O Human Star and the way that more socially progressive narratives were interwoven within more traditional science fiction characteristics. Did you find any challenges that you didn't foresee in trying to take on the historic task of using sci-fi as a means of creating more social understanding?
Yeah, I guess the thing that was most interesting to me as I was developing this thing from its original outline is that, it's primarily a story about this person who became a figurehead, like the Steve Jobs equivalent figure for this very wide impact technological innovation. And the thing that I learned, basically, writing this story and just kind of, being in the world is that it's never really just this one person. There's so many interesting people who had a role to play, and often because of circumstance or identity stuff, like we just don't know their names. So like there's a character in the comic named Lucille, who's a woman of color who has prostheses, like limb prostheses, and she plays like an important role both as the foil for the main characters, but also what she contributes to this like big technological movement both informs what the main characters are able to do, but also like what we see at the end. And I realized like she was important in a lot of ways, not just because she's a very interesting character and I get to come up with a lot of really great prosthetic legs for her to wear, but also like she's kind of a great example of someone who is just as important, and even though the story doesn't spotlight her specifically, her work matters to these people and their lives and also the world. So it makes me sound like a better storyteller than I am because she wasn't in the original like outline to that extent, so that was also me learning. But I feel like by thinking about what this story was actually about, it led to an interesting take on what I think is interesting about technological developments. I don't know. I'm not that good of a storyteller.
Oh, we can do it. Because this is the last panel, one more thing. Okay, last question here.
Yeah, so you mentioned a really interesting thing, Lou, about long-form webcomics, like spanning many years, and how readers can forget the details. Do you ever think about doing what other serialized media does, with like opening the chapter with like a previously on?
Oh. No, I haven't. That's not a bad idea. That might be something to think about if I were to do a decade-long webcomic again.
Andrew, do you work in that? This is your work issue by issue.
Oh, yeah.
Do you consciously say, let me go back a minute and say, or is there?
Well, yeah, I used to. So the comic, they're kind of oversized, so they come out quarterly as well. So I think the first 4 issues from Volume 1, there was no kind of recap or anything. Then I just got to thinking about it. I was like, the last issue that came out was like 45 pages of story, and it was 3 months ago. I sure shit wouldn't remember any of it. There's no way. So I started to put a previously on, just a quick kind of recap, not even anything with like straight out, like, I mean, my wife's my editor, she was like, it's kind of spoilery. I was like, in theory, they read it already. So fine, like, I should give them all of the pieces, and so I tried to get in there and be like, these were the surprises or whatever, because it's like, I know how I am as a reader, and there's a lot that it's gonna go in, it's gonna come out, and I'm not gonna carry it to the next one. So I think it was good. And a few people were like, hey, thanks for those.
You can play around with that convention too. Like I want to say Next Wave. Does anyone remember the comic series Next Wave? I think they did something like that where they like had fun and made jokes and goofed around in like the previously in the last issue of Next Wave, like and make it joke filled. Like that's pretty fun. I think we can do that.
There's one thing that I do that I feel like I always have this theory or whatever that like if like when you read something or see something, it will leave like an imprint on you that's probably something kind of subconscious in a way. So sometimes if I want to recall someone's memory of something, earlier on, I'll try to find a panel that I can just bring back in some way, like lightbox in that or copy paste something digital or whatever. Like that exact like panel or whatever or a pose. So it's like even if they don't necessarily remember that exact moment, like or what was said, they might it just will feel familiar. That might be like some kind of like subconscious link to earlier. I don't know if it works, but I try to do something like that.
Mm-hmm.
I had a question for Charles. I saw that End of the Fucking World got a second season on Netflix.
Mm-hmm.
I'm confused because the book seemed pretty finite.
I'm confused too.
Well, congrats.
Okay, so this is the last panel, and Mice is actually closing for the day now, but our panelists have copies of their books, so you can come up, look at their books, talk with them, buy books if you want, or come back tomorrow and look at them, talk to them at their tables. Thank you very much for attending, and thank you all to our panelists, Liz, Charles, Andrew, and Kate.